beholden to point out we shouldn't be listening to would be opportunistic politicians using this as an opportunity to either attack opponents with little or no reason, not just politicians, of course, plenty of people in the media as well, or even worse. So I listened to Suella Braverman this morning, a woman who chose to join a political party after it emerged that it was led by a man whose school contemporaries claim to recall him repeatedly engaging in the most vile anti-Semitism, up to and including in chanting "gas the Jews" and insisting that Hitler was right. Nigel Farage, of course, also hosted a conference that saw that Lucy Connolly person invited onto a stage and receive a hero's welcome after she was quite rightly jailed for using social media to call for a pogrom in Britain, to call for people in Britain to be burnt in their beds, effectively, in the buildings that they were inhabiting. So quite how anybody can think that they have a right to speak out against something that their own party, whether it's violence against a community or whether it is base anti-Semitism, is riddled with allegations of. Some of the stuff that's coming out about various politicians we're prevented from reporting in full at the moment because of purdah. So let's silence that noise. Other noise that perhaps should be zoned out a little bit would include Benjamin Netanyahu's attempts to portray Britain or the British government in a negative light over this, because Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, is a man who, were he to set foot in London tomorrow, our authorities would be required to arrest him. When he flies to visit his friend Donald Trump in the United States of America, they have to alter the flight path to avoid flying over countries where he would also, it would also be required that he was arrested. And to take sort of moral lessons from him is extraordinary, frankly. My friend who is not taking their son to Hebrew playgroup this weekend as a consequence of the kind of fears that we are talking about today picks up on that point, and so too does David Aranovich in his latest Substack. The idea that Netanyahu is going to try to pretend, if you like, that the war in Iran would have been more successful if only European allies had joined in, and therefore the attacks upon the British government today, the accusations being levelled against the British government are, well, they need to be understood, don't they? My friend who is not taking their son to Hebrew kindergarten on this weekend writes the following. I'm going to read it at some length because it really is important. I listened to the phone-in when you discussed the most recent attacks last week, and I very much appreciated your view, which I share, that it should be possible and necessary to oppose Netanyahu's genocide and endless war agenda while also opposing anti-Semitism at the same time. I think there was a loaded word missing from the conversation: Zionism. It's a difficult term because it means many different things to different people, even among Jewish and Israeli people. Itamar Ben-Gvir, for example, has hijacked it and named his party the Religious Zionists, while Yair Golan, who sits on the opposite end of the political spectrum, also defines himself as a Zionist. They clearly don't mean the same thing. I fear that among the anti-genocide community, which I feel part of in many ways, Zionism, which is to me predominantly the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in the land they have inhabited for decades, but by no means a justification for genocide, is often reduced to something purely evil. Defining oneself as anti-Zionist, which I hear more and more often, can become a bridge to anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is, to my mind, a valid position when one can clearly justify what it means to them, but more often than not, when I've challenged friends on what Zionism means to them, they couldn't really say, or it essentially boiled down to the dismantling of the modern Jewish state. So according to that analysis, which I think is pretty close to faultless, it's a word that is so loaded now and so nuanced that it can't really be it's why it was missing from the conversation that they refer to. It can't really be introduced into the conversation coolly or calmly. And then calls to ban marches in solidarity with the Palestinian people also seem to me to execute a hideous conflation of things that we need to keep separate. Offering support for the Palestinian people or condemning genocide in Gaza does not and should never be conflated with hatred of Jews or anti-Semitism. Of course, it happens from all angles. Benjamin Netanyahu frequently claims that every atrocity that his government undertakes is justified by the need to protect Jews. But Benjamin Netanyahu undertakes on an almost daily basis precisely the conflation that people often accused of anti-Semitism in this country are condemned for conflating. It's hideous. And those of us who have managed to maintain objectivity and step back, because you don't have personal skin in the game, so to speak, step back from the incredibly binary nature of much of this debate, have seen this coming from 1,000 miles away. The idea that that Netanyahu would somehow be good for international relations or even for Jewish people in this country has struck me for a very long time as grimly unlikely. David Aranovich's latest Substack, which I think was published in one of the Jewish newspapers before events in Golders Green yesterday. It's a great piece under the headline "Israel has finally lost the West," explaining what I have just tried to précis myself. But he's provided a postscript to it, which says, 2 days before I published this, a man stabbed two, visibly, that's the chief rabbi's description, Jewish people in the suburb of Golders Green, an area close to where I live and which I often visit. So I'm drawing on three areas of thought from Jewish people, two of whom have got in touch with me personally, and one of whom has a rather splendid Substack to which I subscribe. The police said the suspect had a history of serious violence and mental health issues, but nevertheless were treating the incident as a case of terrorism. What was particularly ominous about this was the idea that this man had identified obvious Jews as a target for his rage. And now he comes to the point I've just tried to make. Immediately after the attack, as has become its habit, the Israeli government blamed the British government for somehow allowing the attack, as though there is a world where a single figure carrying a concealed knife on a suburban street can always be stopped before he attacks someone. There is, writes David Aronovich, I think, a kind of dark chutzpah to an allegation like that. I can't sit inside the addled brain of this week's attacker, but my guess is that it's their supposed association with Israel that may well be behind his murderous assaults. So there are some examples of the things that I think we should be trying to dial down when it comes to asking the question about what we should be doing instead. Okay? It's 14 minutes after 10. OMG, James, your opening remarks feel like the first sane thing I have heard since this happened, writes Reg. Keep it up, mate. The UK needs sanity. Thank God sensible discussion has returned to the airwaves, writes Kelly. And I mean, on a similar theme, I should probably read out a few more messages in the course of the morning. But I want to start by asking you this question. Turn down the volume on people who remain silent about anti-Semitism when it is alleged against their own party leader, or remain approving of calls for pogroms against other minorities or other communities. Zone out the self-serving words of the Israeli regime, led, as I will repeatedly remind you, by a man who would be arrested were he to set foot, or would be required to be arrested by the authorities were he to set foot in this country. But think also for a moment, focus upon the ancient hatreds that are bubbling to the surface once again. Separate, or at least try to separate, if you can, your feelings about current events in the Middle East from a millennia-old, 2 millennia-old bigotry, hatred, violence. I mean, one of the things I have to try to keep out of my contemplations and my thinking on mornings like this is the fact that the words Jew hate or anti-Semitism have been so liberally sprinkled around this country by and directed at people who are nothing of the sort, as everybody honest knows. You almost wonder what vocabulary you need to describe the events that happen in Golders Green and what appears to be the motivation behind them. If you're going to describe people marching in solidarity with dead Palestinian children as being Jew haters, what words have you got left to describe the attacker in Golders Green yesterday? Who, I mean, there are no words to describe the contempt that one feels towards him. And perhaps that's the problem. There are no words left to describe the contempt one feels towards him, because the words have all been used up by the kind of people who used to message me with allegations of anti-Semitism for simply mourning the slaughter of innocents in the person who I told you has decided not to take their young son to a Hebrew playgroup in North London for the first time. That was due to happen this weekend and is now not going to happen. They also point out, and I won't paraphrase this, I'll read their words entirely, that Netanyahu is desperately trying to promote a narrative in which a change in the Iranian regime could have been possible if lazy Europeans had joined his and Trump's just war. The words lazy and Trump and just are in quotes there. And there is a cautious suggestion that it serves his narrative that nowhere other than Israel is safe for Jews, although, of course, there are attacks on Jews on the streets of Israel as well. 18 minutes after 11 is the time. What the government of Israel does reflects on us as Jews and reflects on our Judaism. Therefore, it is our Jewish obligation to be in dialogue with that in some way. And another contribution, if you like, to the conflation conversation, and that comes from Rabbi Josh Levy, who co-leads a progressive Judaism in this country, a newly formed movement representing around a third of synagogues in the UK. And they warned yesterday that Israel's current political direction risks becoming incompatible with Jewish values, while insisting that criticism of the country's government is a Jewish obligation rather than an act of disloyalty. Of course, it's not that long ago that the Board of Deputies of British Jews suspended members who wrote to the Financial Times newspaper to criticise the country's government. So, look, if it's confusing to talk about Zionism, and it really is a very tricky word to use because it means so many different things to so many different people, most obviously, if you're keeping up to date with Israeli politics, most obviously the fact that both Itamar Ben-Gvir and Yair Gallant describe themselves as Zionists despite not really agreeing about anything except the right of Israel to exist, which is what I used to take the word to mean, but of course it means something very different to very many people now. But even here, you know, if you've got an organisation that represents around a third of synagogues in the UK calling for criticism of Israel as a Jewish obligation rather than an act of disloyalty, while one of the biggest Jewish organisations in the country suspends members for writing a letter to the Financial Times, it's not exactly stochastic terrorism, is it? Writing a letter to the Financial Times condemning Israel. So you can't even talk about a Jewish community or a Jewish position on questions like this. Or, as ever on this programme, tell me that I've got everything upside down and wrong and that we should be doing something completely different instead. Tony's in Finchley. Tony, what would you like to say?
Yes, I might be echoing a few of your points earlier, but I just wanted to say you asked the question of what needs to be done, and this is something I've written to, and I've spoken to Sarah Sackman about quite a few times.
That's the MP for the area. That's the MP for Golders Green, for people who don't know.
Yep. And I've written to the chief rabbi, who's based in Finchley as well. Yep. I wrote a letter to him 2 weeks ago saying, unless you take action to stop the conflation, there will be a deadly anti-Semitic attack. It will increase. So what I think we need to do, and this has been something that's been building for decades,
yes.
But I would correct you on one minor point, and this is something, a narrative that just seems to have got through unchallenged, is that anti-Semitism started to grow again following the attacks as if somebody, it's not like people said, oh gosh, there's just been the most horrific attack, a murder of innocent Jews. That makes me feel anti-Semitic.
Yes.
What started it was when people started seeing bombing of hospitals and these images everywhere of dead Palestinian children. And what do we see from Jewish leaders? No condemnation. Time and time again, they will not condemn it. They're supporting Israel, and they will not accept that, pretty much since 73, 82, Israel's been getting more and more right-wing, more and more expansionist, more and more aggressive. Like you say, this...
But just to clarify, you're a Jewish man yourself.
Yes, not that it should matter. But
well, it matters a bit. I think there's things that you can say that other people would receive a different kind of criticism for saying. I think you run the risk of being accused of being a self-hating Jew rather than an anti-Semite. But you are teetering on a tightrope, Tony.
Yes.
Of the distinction between excuse and explanation, because there is no excuse for the events that we saw in Golders Green yesterday, but you are providing a form of explanation by linking it to the continuing catastrophe in Gaza and of course latterly in Lebanon as well.
And what the right will say is, you're victim blaming. This is how they get out of it.
Not just the right, not just the right,
yes.
but it's a feasible allegation, isn't it?
It is, except for the fact that firstly the victims are never the perpetrators. Right. They're never the rabble risers in the media.
Sure.
But yeah, the victims are obviously the people on the street. But the fact is, like you said, people won't answer the question when you say, "What do you think you should actually do to stop anti-Semitism?"
Yeah.
Because if you say we will not tolerate anti-Semitism, if you imagine you're a Muslim and you see these horrific videos, you see what Israel's doing, it's terrible. You see all the Muslim leaders condemning Muslim extremism. And by the way, I said to your producer, I previously, when Corbyn made the comparison of Israel with ISIS, I thought that was very wrong.
So did I.
Now I'm afraid we have to accept Israel is a rogue state run by right-wing extremists.
Okay, so what would happen? Every rabbi in the country would come out and condemn Benjamin Netanyahu, or the Board of Deputies would stop suspending people for writing to the Financial Times in condemnation of Israel, and you think that some of the warped minds currently fomenting hatred would be helped to a place where they could separate the Jewish diaspora from the current Israeli regime?
Yeah, and the British Board of Deputies, by the way, they were never Zionists. They were against Zionism.
I'm going to take your word for this. I don't have the history.
This is old history, and you might arguably say they were wrong. But their attitudes, we represent the Jews in our community, and that's what the rabbi needs to do. What if support for Israel is very high among the Jewish community in this country? Then we're in the worst of all imaginable worlds. Well, then, and that's what depresses me most. But again, it's education, because as long as you keep saying things, conflating anti-Semitism with, opposition to what Israel's doing, and you rightly said Zionism is a term that's almost lost its meaning because it's changed.
And it means so many different things to so many different people.
Well, exactly like your friend's letter said, it is essentially the desire for a homeland of a Jewish state. It's a nationalism. But nationalism takes on different meanings when you have a state.
Of course it does.
And Israel, unfortunately, has not come to terms with its treatment of the Palestinians. And, somebody said like 30 years ago, if you want to become left-wing in Israel, you just maintain your position, And it's been moving further and further that way.
Is there anything, I don't want to sound silly, but is there anything easier that can be done in the shorter term? Because what you're calling for is more than turning around an oil tanker, isn't it? It's like a sort of just an entire sea change among thousands and thousands of people. But in the shorter term, in terms of what a government can do, because that's what all the opportunistic politicians whose own parties are riddled with allegations and examples of anti-Semitism, but suddenly discover a deep love for the Jewish community at times like this.
Like Farage.
Yes, exactly that. But they're all calling for the government to do something, or the authority. Can you put anything on that list?
Well, firstly, I'd say do something different, because what they've done so far hasn't worked. Secondly, it's partly still wishful thinking, but you say, I did it again. I said to Sarah Sackman, she, by the way, she's very, in many ways she's great, and she says Netanyahu is evil, is a hideous human being. And I said, we'll shout it from the rooftops instead of saying we've got to ban.
Again, I'm taking your word for that. I haven't seen that myself, but I'm just clarifying that.
But my point is, the response from Labour is ban Palestine Action Committee. What message do you think that sends out? You can't ban anti-Semitism, and by trying to single it out as something that deserves some special attention, all you're going to do is increase the divide, particularly here where we've got a very high Muslim community and a large Jewish community. The leaders need to bridge that gap whilst it's being divided. The rabbi should be on his way right now and talking to all the imams and working out what we can do together. Some kind of joint statement. If the Pope condemns Trump, nobody says the Pope is Trump was what I say, he's anti-American, But unless we ram it home that what Israel is doing is contrary to all Jewish values, and as many people in Israel are saying, then the problem will get worse.
And yes, well, you've covered an awful lot of ground and you've garnered an awful lot of positive response. I'm interested in what a negative response would look like. I'm interested in how anybody could think anything, or why people would think, or anybody would think that anything Tony has said is problematic or controversial. And that is what we do together every morning. We well, not every morning, sometimes. The territory is rather lighter, but we dig into this stuff, and you're welcome to do that now. Tony, thank you. You've taken me a little late for the news, but I can hardly blame you.